women's achievements and challenges for social participation. And this is related to oppression. And American women are met with a lot of things that are similar too, because of the fact that there's just not enough jobs for everyone to be on the payroll. I believe this article discusses traditional gender roles. So, this article discusses some of the significant improvements in the status of women in Cuban society and reflects on the persistence of traditional gender patterns, focusing on the analysis on the female gender. It refers to some of the main components that allows a platform for women's social participation to be built from the revolutionary process while identifying major gaps in gender equality that hindered the empowerment of Cuban women. The balance of achievements and challenges is analyzed according to the access to facets of well being, including employment, education, and health areas considered important for assessing women's involvement in Cuban society. In each of the major milestones are identified and main challenges that women have to confront in order to achieve their full and equitable social participation are emphasized. The two most prominent traditional features of the social position of Cuban women and the main barriers to social participation are women's continued overburden of domestic and family responsibility and their limited access to senior management positions. My gosh, this sounds very similar to the United States. Cuban women developed their participation with such a creative force that they transform themselves in the process of fighting for the permanence of society's achievements and values. Keywords: women, achievements, family, social participation. Introduction. This article discusses some of the significant improvements in the status of women in Cuban society and reflects on the persistence of traditional gender patterns, focusing on the analysis of the female gender. I start from the premise of gender as a determinant social process that establishes polarizing traits and behaviors in both genders. These socially constructed patterns impose a state of social segregation and subordination on women that affect all areas and stages of their existence and are modified and sustained according to the historical, social, economic, class, cultural, ethnic, and religious conditions. Some of the main conditions which allowed a pattern for women's social participation to be built from the revolutionary process are: the Federation of Cuban Women, FMC, was created in 1960, giving women an important venue for participation and contributing significantly to their development. Between 1965 and 1985, the women labor force doubled and birth rates halved, illustrating women's progressive social inclusion. Oh, that's interesting. The workforce doubled and births decrease. So right here, this paper is actually saying that from 1965 to 85, the female labor force doubled and birth rates declined because women were going into the workforce in Cuba. Half the beneficiaries of the literary campaign in 1961 were women, and 50% of the facilitators that carried it out were very young women, demonstrating the participation of women in relevant revolutionary programs from the beginning. Uh, Specialized courses were offered that contributed to subverting women's traditional roles. The FMC organized classes for housewives and rural women that fulfilled the dual role of educating women and making them social activists in their community. Oh, that's interesting. So you educate women, you send them to college, and then they become social activists. And so now we can use the internet to actually empower other women who have not gone to college to become social activists for their own self. So they live in their communities and they're going to be able to see other things that I'm not able to see. So there's going to be things in their community that I'm not aware of. And so we can share this education and this, how this works with people who are just as intelligent as anybody who's gone to college. And then they're going to be able to speak out and share things with the chains of authorities and leadership of things in their own communities that need assistance and help due to inflation, because I have this belief everyone in the United States is affected with inflation. I don't care who you are. I don't care what part of the totem pole you're on related to your pyramid and your Ponzi scams and all that stuff. But of particular importance were the schools of revolutionary instruction for women, where thousands of women from different social backgrounds, ages, and occupational profiles were trained. Special programs offered courses to elderly householders, prostitutes, and women from all strata that embarked on their new lives of employability. But also noteworthy are the sources of gaps in gender equality that hinder Cuban women's empowerment. Initially, it was believed that subjective changes would automatically follow structural changes, which provided to be unrealistic. Feminist theory was largely underestimated, and it is still insufficiently conveyed. Traditional gender roles in the family and home are still prevalent. This sounds just like the United States. But this is from Cuba. This is a study from Cuba that someone wrote up. Despite progress, inadequate access for women to high-level leadership positions persists. In analysis, the balance of achievement and challenges is terms. CEO is just not going to cut it, because CEO is something that is so few women can actually even achieve of anything. And this is a bunch of nonsense saying, "Oh, well, you're a CEO of your own life." Well, that's what which we can say that, but the problem with that is that they're talking about a CEO of a company managing billions and billions of dollars. That's not achievable for the majority of people. And so this puts the affluent people and the money people in the power seat of the hands of the greedy. And so, we need to push back from society from the ground level up, what they always called the grassroots. But, too many of the CEOs and the money people, I think that probably even George Soros and some of those who put money are making fun of people too much to actually be of any service to actually help us, so they're just helping one side. They're not helping all of America. So wherever George Soros dumped his money, he should have actually helped everybody if he was going to do that. Um, I don't know what your word is. So despite progress, inadequate access for women to high-level leadership positions persists. I analyze the balance of achievements and challenges in terms of access to facets of well-being, including employment, education, and health areas considered important for accessing women's involvement in Cuban society. Okay, we have that right here in the United States too. It's happening right here in the USA. So hopefully people are listening to this who are from other countries, because we have women in the United States who have no health care. We're stuck with inflation, and it's challenging for us in our own country to even get the help that we need. And so, let's see here. Okay, let's move on down here. Access to, okay. I gotta get on the right page here. Okay. Okay. The declining birth rate is a key factor in women remaining in school and in the workforce. The three components contribute. Okay, let's see if I can get this down here. To higher quality of life of these paid employment breaks and traditional gender pattern most swiftly. So women have a better quality of life by not having children and not getting married, is what it's showing with Cuba, that they don't have to deal with a man because he's a pain in the neck. They're dealing with the same thing. And I actually in the past 3.5 years, I spoke with a woman from Cuba, and she actually said that the men from Cuba are violent to women. So that's a multicultural thing that's taking place, a phenomenon that is unfortunately a trend around the United States, where men treat women poorly who are in marriages. That's what's happening. Men are treating women very poorly in marriages because it keeps women oppressed. It keeps them from actually doing anything in life, and especially when there's not jobs created for women, you know. And, so right now, there's more jobs created for men than there is women when you want to think about it like that. And, hey, you can think of the military like that too. I mean, that's for a long, long time. It's only been in the past, 5 years that women could fight in combat? Something like that. I'm not sure exactly. But when women assume the role of income provider, they acquire autonomy, social recognition, coworkers, networks, and higher self-esteem. That is true. When I had my own money, I felt so much better about myself. And when I felt secure and I was living in a house in a place that was safe, that's absolutely true. However, it's in the educational process where substantial changes can be expected in stereotypical attitudes and behaviors that affect the way we live and think about women and men. Precisely because it's a social and cultural construction, the role pattern can only be amended in a comprehensive, transformative, and emancipatory way on the ideological plane. Employment. According to the 1953 census in Cuba, the female employment rate was just 13.7%. These women worked predominantly as domestic servants and prostitutes under the guise of service staff in nightclubs selling alcohol beverages. Oh my goodness. Let me look this up and say, okay, 1953. Let's go to 1953 and actually see what we can find about American women. The percentage of American in 1953, in how many women, let's ask Google here. How many women, what was the percentage of women working in USA in 1953? Okay, United States only had a 34.4% labor force of women. So it was only about 20% more than Cuba. And so we can just take the same assumption and plug in here when it says these women were predominantly as domestic servants and prostitutes under the guise of service staff in nightclubs selling alcohol and beverages. And, the thing that I think about with that is it's like, well, my gosh, don't they still do that? Um, I mean, I've seen clubs that actually do that, it sounds like, and eventually they get busted because that's what they're doing. That the service staff, in the strip bars, eventually they get shut down. I know there was one in the town that I lived in growing up. There was some of the stripper clubs, and I would have never thought I mean, you hear rumors, you just don't think about that they're actually doing that. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt they're not actually doing that, but then it turns out they are. And that's one of the things I remember about the girl I went to high school with who ended up pregnant. I mean, my own self, it wasn't that much long after she had her baby that I ended up pregnant after we graduated, but she was probably about, 5 months pregnant, and they let her finish, I believe, because we were so close to graduation. They didn't make her go to a different school. Usually they made them go to different schools. But some 52% of all working women resided in the capital. In the 1960s, after the triumph of the revolution, there was a movement to reincorporate women into the workforce, resulting in education efforts. During the years from 1960 to 1980, women's employment grew at an annual rate of 8%, sharper than male employment growth. In every 100 individuals added to the workforce, 69 were women. So following the 1960s, important laws were adopted that favored women's social participation. The Maternity Law, Family Code, Constitution of the Republic, approved by the referendum of 1976 and revised by a constitutional reform in 1992, Worker Safety and Health Law 1977, Social Security Act of 1979, Penal Code 1979. During the 1980s, the Labor Code and employment policy regulations were enacted. This is in Cuba? My goodness. The unemployment rate fell in 1970 to 1.3% and remained relatively low, ranging from 3.6% to in 1981 and 4% in 1989. In 2003, unemployment fell to 2.3%, which is full employment according to international standards. 2.3% means that you still are carrying a 2.3% of unemployment. I mean, and so that's not the full country. If you add the full country into that, you have a really huge number of unemployment. And I think that's probably why they do that, because they can't predict an increase or decrease of the population of people, or where jobs are going to contract and be taken away. The country suffered an economic crisis in the final decade of the last century, 1990 to 2000, due to the disappearance of the socialist bloc in Eastern Europe, which represented over 85% of Cuba's trade. Taking advantage of the situation and seeking to facilitate the immediate collapse of the Cuban socialist model, the U.S. government intensified the economic blockade that it had imposed on Cuba since the revolutionary triumph Torres-Silly Act 1992 and Helms-Burton Act 1995. These laws not only prohibit U.S. relationships with Cuba, but also extend the restrictions to third world countries in blatant violation of international principles. Employment restructuring caused by the crisis meant the reduction or transfer of non-state jobs, causing a decrease of 500,000 people in the economic active population. Despite this, a certain balance was maintained in the labor sector, with unemployment estimated at 6%, coexisting with a significant number of unfulfilled positions. So I'm getting the idea that potentially the United States went ahead and did business with Cuba in a roundabout sort of way to actually violate. I hope that's what I'm understanding this as now, as I've aged, because when I think about everything going on down there in the Caribbean and food being placed on those islands, then technically there's a roundabout sort of, oh, absolutely, that makes sense, because I was thinking that is so horrible to think our country would actually not provide food to people who need it. But then if they do business onto islands, and then those islands transfer the food to Cuba, then the United States has no idea what, they're not, our country's not violating any peace treaties or anything now, is it? No. I mean, I would hope they weren't, but actually that's what someone on one of the trips that I went on, that's what they said though. What they said was that the United States came into the islands, and then they want to buy up all the land, and then they want to mass produce crops, and then they take business away from the small guy who's working on the islands. However, but the question I would have to ask though is, because what they said on all the islands, though, on the tropical islands off of the United States in that area, which includes Cuba, but Cuba's the only one that was communist, I thought. I think the rest of them we could actually go to, but Cuba was the only one. But the one woman was saying that they couldn't do any business, and I'm thinking, well, if there wasn't ships going down onto the islands, who would they do business with? How would anybody even know they exist? So if someone wasn't actually sending ships there, and what they did admit and say is that tourism was their main business. They said down in the Caribbean, tourism is their big business. So the majority of them said that down in the countries down there in the Caribbean, tourism is their main business. And so there was a few others who had said that there was crops growing down there, which the United States has crops growing down in the Caribbean. So the United States literally does own land down in the Caribbean. There are United States of American sectors down there, but I would imagine that we have a trade. Think of this, how weird it would be with the tariffs now, that the United States actually has to tariff goods from part of the Virgin Islands. Now, because there's parts on the Virgin Islands that's part British, and then it belongs to another country. I think France maybe. One of the Virgin Islands is literally split. One of them is split. And so think, but so think of this as tariffing. So you cross a line on land and you have to do a tariff. Well, that's with Canada too. But yeah, I don't like the idea of withholding food from people, due to sanctions and things like that. So it does, so when they talk about China actually dropping things off in other places to avoid tariffs, so you just take and you drop your stuff off at other countries where there's no tariffs involved to avoid paying the tariffs into the United States. And then you get away with the lower, cheaper prices. They could even do that on the Caribbean. Oh my gosh, they would put the Caribbean in business big time if those China shipping dropped things off in the Bahamas. That's a foreign country. And they set up some warehouses down there, kept them in business, and then ship it into the United States. I mean, it's offshore. No one's going to be paying any attention. And they can avoid the tariffs that way, can't they? I think that sounds like a plan. I mean, because I was thinking the same thing. It's like, that's horrible to think. I know they called Fidel Castro a dictator, and that's where we learned about dictators from. Even though I can't even say that Cuba had a military, but basically what it was, that he was backed by Russia or something like that. But there was something about the people and them being suppressed from the rest of modern culture, which a lot of those islands down there, they are kind of old, but they said when the Eastern Bloc countries fell, then Cuba lost. That's what this article here said. So I'm hoping that that's what our country did, was put food onto the Caribbean islands and then redirect it over to Cuba. I mean, because that's what I would do if I was strategizing this related to the tariffs. I would see, okay, this is what they talk about with the migrants, so they tell the migrants, okay, go to your nearest country. That's where you claim asylum for. So if you want asylum and a reprieve from tariffs, find the nearest country, find a country where there's not tariffs, drop the stuff off there, and then ship it on to the United States. Put the Caribbean back in business with some drop shipping or some shipping through there. They take the old labels off, put on new labels, and put them in business with shipping. I mean, doesn't it make sense? And then you avoid paying the tariffs. I mean, heck, some rich guy you could use Epstein Island. You guys could use Epstein Island. It belongs to Donald would love. Oh my gosh, Donald would love this. He would make so much money doing this. You can't, I mean, do you see what happens when we have great minds who are brainstorming here? How we avoid paying tariffs. It's the same thing with paying taxes too. You don't have to be a rich person to actually think like a rich person. I mean, you could be, if my name was Richard or something like that, you only have to be rich in name only to actually, think of something so genius as what I just thought of, and to avoid paying tariffs. That's all you got to do. So, this makes complete sense to me. Like, my gosh, we can, I mean, the government don't pay any attention. The court system already said that with the foster kids. They said once they designate them a foster kid, or once they designate someone TBI, they just take a hands-off approach. And, Congress does the same thing. They take a hands-off approach. So you can just redirect your, avoid, well, my God, create a new country. There's plenty of islands out there, isn't there? I'm sure you can find an island that is still way above sea level, high enough that you could put up a base of some sort. Not a base, a warehouse. Not a base. We don't want to call it a base. It's just got to be like a warehouse for shipping purposes, because there's so much stuff being shipped with our international trade partners that we want to keep it going. We don't want to create animosity and hostilities with those countries because we have a poor leader right now. I think that's what I have to call him, a poor leader instead of a dictator. He's a very poor leader, and he has bad business skills, even though he thinks he's great and people are blowing smoke up his woo-ha. So yeah, so there's plenty. I mean, I think some when I went down there, they said there was like thousands of Bahamian islands in the Bahamas. The Bahamas is a separate island. So this is what I'm thinking. This is my thought process. So during times when tourism is not great, the people in the Bahamas need jobs. Give them warehouse jobs. Let them do some shipping through the Bahamas. I mean, Amazon can pay for it, right? Jeff Bezos and Amazon, and I mean, and so I think it sounds like a great idea. I mean, because we're always looking for ways to create new business and have new trade partners. And for this to go through the Bahamas, and I mean, it could go through Epstein Island, though, too. I mean, there's a mansion there. That would be a great place, actually, in that mansion, you could have a post office and you could house people there in the mansion. It would kind of be like probably a luxury accommodations, which eventually would probably not be so luxurious anymore. But it would be for the staff to be there working on the island and the people who are working there. Because I know that it sounds, a lot of the people on the islands, they would say that they would have to take a ferry from one island to another island to work. That's what they were saying, that they would literally take either a boat or an airplane from one island to the next island to get on there to do work. And so there was one man, he was from Miami, and he told us specifically, he said that he would go to Miami for about 6 months out of the year, and then he would fly back down to Turks and Caicos for his tourism job. So it almost sounded like he didn't literally live on the island. He said he lived on the island. He said his brother lived there too. But it was so small. It was only 7 miles. And it's a former military base. So it kind of looks to me, I don't know if immigration is still taking place through the islands, or if they just put people there. I think that's cruel if they're just putting people there. Um, because and shipping them from other countries. If someone's doing that, that's cruel just to, put them on islands just because they can. Um, but I know that I had actually watched a video that said the United States had tried to get some people to move from an island because it was flooding, and that's the main reason. But then they say the people don't want to move, and I'm thinking, take me. I will go. If you can help me get out of a place that's flooding, and you have the means to be able to help me relocate to someplace else where I have a safe place to live, I'll volunteer. Help me go to a place where I know that I'm going to be safe and I'm going to be taken care of. I will go. I don't want to stay on an island that's flooding and it's going to be 25 feet above my head during a hurricane. Take me. So let's finish reading some of this. The economic crisis impacted by the Cuban labor market, severing the relationship between the quality and results of one's work and remuneration received. Oh, this reminds me, I was watching live streams out of Cuba. What was this? Maybe about 6 months ago or so. It was really interesting. The person, all they were doing though was walking around. They were just showing live streams of people in Cuba. I found that kind of interesting. To me, it kind of just looks like any old rundown town in the United States of America. Nothing any different. And that's what I thought when I went to visit the islands. I thought, well, they just kind of look like any old rundown town in the United States of America. But you know what? You know who doesn't like that? The people selling the tourism don't like that. Well, I think it's changing right now. I think that the tourism is changing because of the fact that there's so many people that are putting the rundown parts of the islands on the internet right now, and they have live stream cameras there, that people who are going to visit an island can see that it's not all fluffy beautiful like what they portray on TV, that they're lying about that. But I kind of literally got in trouble for that a little bit by people on the internet, and when I was posting videos of the rundown parts of the islands, they didn't like that. Where was I? Oh, Belize. Belize was one of the worst. And yeah, Belize was one of the worst. I don't know if that port is still open or not. I mean, Belize is beautiful. Don't get me wrong, it's beautiful there, but it's just the city was a big dump. And the guy, what he told us, he said they built a wall. They just built a small seawall and pushed the water back. So technically, the area he was telling us about, he said it was underwater. So they built some kind of seawall to hold the water back, and so to buy it just a little bit more time. So it sounded like that maybe they put in some raised dirt landfill as well. And it's kind of like I watched this video today. There was this guy, and the water, I would say it was maybe 200 feet away from him. He was right next to the ocean. There was a big rock cliff, and a huge rock cliff, but he said that there was water coming up through the sand. So he said he took a drink of it, and he said that the water was fresh water. There was absolutely no salt in there. And so I left him a message. Most of them, I never hear anything back from him at all, but I left him a message, and I said, well, is it possible that the ocean water is pushing through the sand so hard that it has filtered out all the salt water? I mean, that's just my thought right there with that it's filtered out all the salt water, and that's why it doesn't taste like sand. Because I've noticed that when I get sand in my mouth next to the ocean, it tastes like salt. So it's kind of like the sand next to the ocean and the water pushing through and up is a filter, because when you do a natural filter in, like with a creek. I know my my mother-in-law, well, she's my only mother-in-law that I ever had. She's passed away now. She actually had a pond, a lagoon, and she called it the pond water. She thought it was so funny. She's like, "Oh, this is some good pond water." and they got their water from a pond. And so they did the charcoal, and so they had a pump house where they pumped water, I guess, up in there. And so it ran through rocks, and so there was things they'd have to put in there, rocks and charcoal and layers of sand and stuff like that they put in there, and then they would pump it up to the house. Eventually they got city water. They put in a great big pipe and put in city water. But she had two faucets then, one that was city water, which they had to pay, but the other one they didn't have to pay because it was free. And so her husband started working for the water district, and as his other job. And they were installing water to rural people instead of them having to use a pump out there in the farming areas. The economic crisis impacted by the Cuban labor market, severing the relationship between the quality and results of one's work and the remuneration received. The circulation of two currencies, the Cuban peso and US dollar, displaced labor to jobs with access to the latter because of its greater purchasing power. See, and that's what the people are talking about from the other countries, is that the United States, I don't know how the United States dollar has greater purchasing power, because it really doesn't. Not for us here in the United States, it doesn't. I mean, the higher the dollar is, the less we can buy. The less we can buy in the United States, and the less we can buy from other countries. So this makes no sense, because it's like when the dollar is being devalued. So when we have inflation and then the private sector pushes prices up, then then that just means we have less. I mean, okay, we could use the American dollar and buy something in another country really cheap because of how they do things, maybe. But here in our own country, and the business class is devaluing the American dollar. Yet, although internationally, the impacts of the economic recession on the labor markets traditionally fall harder on women's employment, it's not so with the Cuban case. This is due to the female workers being highly trained, and the fact that the greatest male presence was in the productive sector, mainly basic industry and construction, which was hit the hardest. By 2007, the evolution of female participation in the labor force was impressive. Women made up 70% of health and education workers, 65.2% of technicians and professionals, 63.8% of physicians, 53.4% of researchers, and 53.4% of teachers. Now, and so that's interesting to think, okay, so Cuba was probably, what everybody, we always call that a third world country. And so let's say that they didn't have any schools or anything like that, because that's one thing that we always kept hearing about. These countries didn't have any schools, they didn't have anything at all. And so then someone goes in, helps them set up education and medical and things like that. I hope they don't have to deal with the mistakes that's taking place in the United States, because I just hope they don't have to deal with that, because I mean, here in the USA, it doesn't work. Capitalism doesn't work. That's just like having a dictator from Cuba, and that was oppressing people. From these figures alone, the potential of women in the workforce is evident, especially in a context where knowledge is increasingly critical in all areas, and particularly as it relates to production. Women also comprise 60% of the workers in the pharmaceutical industry and 36.5% of workers in the tourism area that are noted for their economic potential and relatively high wages. According to law, Cuban women and men receive equal pay for equal work. A discriminatory difference can be found in terms of access to management positions. Women already occupy the majority of technical jobs. No occupational pyramid by gender exists, since women are not barred from typically male-dominated occupations. In my opinion, future development of women's participation in the labor force will quietly but steadily evolve. The most important thing is to emphasize that we have achieved is in danger of suffering and significant setback. It's really difficult for women who have achieved this level of participation based on qualifications and developed skills to accept a reversal. That's how it is in the United States too. In this area, in addition to ensuring the continuity of free, universal, and high quality education, gender equity at all levels is also deemed highly satisfactory. In preschool education, the insufficient availability of daycare centers for working mothers has been fairly offset by the informal community program, Educate Your Child, that provides guidance to the family from the time of pregnancy, informs the couple about benefits of breastfeeding and responsible parenting, and contributes to the family's psychological and educational preparations. Through these formal and informal programs, care is provided to 98.3% of preschool-aged children. Of these, 47% of children in the daycare centers and 51% participating in informal programs are girls. At the primary education level, we see 99.3% school attendance, with 99.9% of those continuing on to 7th grade. Of the total enrollment in primary schools, 49% are girls. The quality achievement of this level is illustrated by Cuba's performance in the first international comparative study held by UNESCO. Cuba scores 350 points out of 400, with the average being 2.5.